It's funny, the things you start to believe when the night gets long enough. Normally, I'm not one for ghost stories, and I never thought much about all those tales you hear on the road. But tonight, I find myself sitting here in this old diner, telling you about the one night I came to believe. I'd been on Route 9, a stretch of road so quiet you'd swear the world ended somewhere behind you. It was past midnight, and I'd been driving for hours. I was halfway through Texas with nothing but the hum of my rig and the stretch of black asphalt ahead. The air was heavy, like it does out here sometimes, weighing down on you until it feels like something's watching from the edges of your headlights. Watch out for Route 9 at night, they'd said. Some drivers even gave that road a wide berth after sundown, but I figured that was just superstition. I'd heard about the phantom patrolman, sure, a ghostly cop car that would pull you over, and sometimes folks said it was the last stop you'd ever make. But talk like that only went so far with me. Out on these roads, people love a good story to keep themselves entertained. But there was something about that night, something in the silence like the world was holding its breath. My lights barely cut through the thick darkness, and I started to feel the loneliness of the road gnaw at me. You get used to solitude in this line of work, but that night it weighed different, like it wasn't just me out there. The minutes dragged on, the same endless road stretching ahead. My eyes were starting to burn from the strain, so I pulled my cap down, gave my face a rough rub, and told myself I'd hit the next town and call it a night. But then I saw it, headlights flickering far off in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought maybe it was a hallucination. It wouldn't be the first time. These all-nighters can play tricks on you. But the lights kept flickering, getting a little brighter each time, almost like they were trying to reach me. I straightened up, feeling a prickle on the back of my neck. No other vehicles had passed me for miles, and out here you can see someone coming long before they're on you. But these headlights, they were there, and then they weren't. I kept glancing back, my pulse quickening with each look. Something didn't feel right. As the lights drew closer, I told myself it was just another car. Maybe some rancher heading back from town or another trucker catching up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those lights were wrong, like they didn't belong. The lights got closer, blinking in and out in a way that didn't sit right. One moment, they were far back, barely visible. Then they'd flare up bright as the moon, right in my rearview mirror, only to fade out again. The flickering was erratic, like some kind of broken strobe light. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the eye, that I was tired and seeing things. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling my palms start to sweat. Out here, you get a sense of the road, of what's around you. You get used to the isolation, the rhythm of empty miles. But this was different. Every nerve in my body was on edge, like something was just off. After a few miles of this, the lights came back and stayed there. This time, I could make out the shape of the car behind them. A patrol car, by the look of it. A police cruiser out on Route 9 at this hour? Didn't make much sense. There's hardly anything out here except open land, and you'd be lucky to see a sheriff in daylight, let alone at night. But sure enough, the cruiser's lights flicked on. Red and blue, cutting through the dark and washing over the back of my rig. The signal to pull over. I glanced down at my speed, steady at 65, nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, maybe I'd missed a light on my truck, or maybe he thought I was drifting. Figured I'd just cooperate, get it over with, and be on my way. I eased my truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a stop. The patrol car followed suit, its headlights blazing in my mirrors, bright enough to blot out everything else. For a moment, I just sat there, waiting for the officer to come over. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the sense of something wrong intensifying. I rolled down the window and leaned out, looking back to see if he was coming, but the car door didn't open and no one stepped out. Just those lights, flashing, pulsing like they were alive, and every time they swept over my side mirror, a chill ran down my spine. Minutes ticked by. Finally, I figured I'd get out myself, see what the holdup was. Maybe he needed help, or maybe he was waiting for me to come over. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, telling myself to quit being ridiculous, that it was just a cop doing his job. But as soon as my boots hit the ground, I felt it. That prickle of fear, crawling up my neck and settling between my shoulder blades. I stood there staring at that patrol car, something telling me that whatever was inside wasn't quite right. Still, I pushed forward, one step after another, my flashlight beam bouncing off the gravel. When I got close enough, I called out, "Evening, officer," my voice steady, trying to sound normal, polite. But no one answered. I shined the flashlight onto the car, aiming for the driver's window. And that's when I saw him, at least I think I did. The beam of my flashlight hit the driver's side window, and there he was, or at least something that looked like him. The officer sat perfectly still, his face half hidden in the shadows, just barely visible through the glass. It was his uniform that struck me first. Dark, crisp, but oddly dated, like something straight out of an old cop movie. I couldn't put my finger on why, but something about it felt wrong, like it was from another era entirely. "Officer," I called out again, my voice tight, echoing against the emptiness of the road. He turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, until his eyes met mine. But his eyes, they were flat, lifeless, like glass. Even from where I stood, I could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and empty, staring right through me as if he were sizing me up, measuring something I couldn't see. A strange, hollow voice crackled through, distorted like an old radio transmission. "License. Registration." The voice didn't sound human. Not really. It was more like a recording, looping, missing beats, as if someone had taken a handful of words and tried to force them into a conversation. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, but no words came out. Then he repeated it, his voice somehow even flatter, more mechanical. "License, registration." My hand was shaking as I reached into my pocket, fishing out my wallet. I took a step closer to the car, almost against my will, extending my hand to give him the documents. But he didn't reach for them. He just kept staring at me with those empty eyes, as if he were studying my every move. That's when he spoke again, but this time it was something different. His voice took on an odd rhythm, disjointed, almost like he was reading from a script. "Accident. Up ahead. Dangerous. Stay off the road." A chill ran through me, deeper than anything I'd felt before. He sounded like he was delivering a message, but it didn't feel like a warning meant to keep me safe. No, there was something in his tone, something cold and final, as if he were spelling out my fate. I tried to back up, suddenly desperate to put distance between me and the patrol car, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, trapped in the weight of his gaze, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away as I could. Then, just as suddenly, his gaze shifted. He looked past me, down the road, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw something, just a flash of something darker than the night itself, like a shadow moving across the highway. The officer's eyes seemed to follow it, his head turning slowly as if tracking something only he could see. And then, just as quick as it began, the red and blue lights cut out. The road went pitch black, and the patrol car was gone. I stumbled backward, blinking hard, trying to process what had just happened. 1 second, the patrol car was right there, lights flashing, the officer looking straight through me. And then, gone. just like that. The only proof I'd ever seen it were the deep tire marks in the gravel where I'd pulled over. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to catch my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my mind raced, flipping between thoughts that didn't make sense. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even some hallucination from the long hours behind the wheel. But no excuse I could come up with would make that patrol car disappear. It was as if the ground had swallowed it whole. The night felt heavier, darker somehow, and the silence was deafening. I climbed back into my rig, locked the doors, and tried to shake off the feeling of that empty stare still burning through me. My headlights stretched out into the black, illuminating nothing but the empty road ahead. I eased back onto Route 9, desperate to put some distance between me and that stretch of shoulder, but I couldn't get the officer's words out of my head. Accident, up ahead, dangerous, stay off the road. The way he'd said it, like he was reading some fate written in stone, it made my skin crawl. As I drove, I started to remember the stories, the ones I'd heard whispered in truck stops and diners across the state. There was always talk of a phantom patrolman who haunted these back roads, pulling drivers over in the dead of night, warning them of an accident waiting up ahead. Some said the patrolman was a cop who died in a crash years ago, still stuck on his final call, repeating the warning that he'd never finished. Others claimed he was something else entirely, something that didn't let people go once he had them in his sights. I'd laughed it off when I'd first heard it, chalking it up to another ghost story spun by folks with too much time on their hands. But now, sitting in that cab with the darkness pressing in, those stories felt a little too real. I glanced at the clock. Dawn wasn't far off, and if I could just keep moving, I'd hit the next town before the sun came up. But something in me was shifting, tightening. A feeling that whatever I'd seen back there wasn't done with me yet. Ahead, the road stretched on, empty and endless. And somehow, I knew I wasn't alone out here. The next few miles passed in tense silence, the road completely deserted, not a single car in sight. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting those flashing lights to reappear, but the road behind me was empty. Just me, alone, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the faint rattle of my dashboard to keep me company. I told myself to calm down, to focus. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, I thought. People see all kinds of strange things when they're sleep-deprived. But just as that thought crossed my mind, a crackling sound broke through the quiet, coming from my CB radio. Static, thick and heavy, like an old radio tuning into a distant station. The static grew louder, filling the cab, and through the noise I heard fragments of words, garbled, disjointed, but familiar. Accident, up ahead. Dangerous. The exact same words the officer had said to me. My hands tightened on the wheel. My knuckles, white as the static, morphed into voices, layered and overlapping like a dozen people all trying to speak at once. It sounded like cries, gasps, faint whispers that slithered into my mind and left a cold knot in my stomach. I fumbled for the radio, flipping the switch, trying to turn it off, but the voices didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static cut out, leaving a heavy silence. My heart was pounding, and I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just a glitch. But before I could even catch my breath, I saw them, headlights flickering in the rearview mirror. They were back. The same patrol car, or maybe another one, was following me, closing the distance faster than it should have been able to. The lights cut through the dark, casting long, distorted shadows across my dashboard. I pressed harder on the gas, my rig rumbling as it picked up speed, but no matter how fast I went, those headlights stayed right behind me, keeping perfect pace. The patrol car's headlights started flashing again, red and blue, filling my cab with blinding colors that disoriented me, making it hard to focus. The lights seemed too bright, too intense, pulsing in a way that felt wrong, like they weren't coming from this world at all. And through the blinding red and blue, I caught glimpses of that same figure behind the wheel, staring at me with those dead, empty eyes. I gritted my teeth, pushing my rig faster, the engine roaring as I tore down Route 9. But the patrol car was relentless, its lights flashing faster, brighter, until it felt like they were burning straight into my mind. I could hear a faint voice again, crackling through the radio, repeating those same words in a hollow, distorted tone. Accident. Up ahead. Stay. Off the road. The words dripped with a kind of finality, like a sentence handed down from some dark place I couldn't understand. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic clawing at my chest. Every instinct was screaming at me to keep driving, to put as much distance between me and that patrol car as possible. But deep down, I knew there was no outrunning it. Then the lights behind me started to flicker, and the patrol car's headlights faded, only to reappear a second later, closer than before. Each time they disappeared and reappeared, they moved a little nearer, as if the car was blinking in and out of reality, closing in on me piece by piece. And with each flicker, I caught a flash of that face, staring, unblinking, watching me like I was some cornered animal. I clenched the wheel, my knuckles aching, and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine whined in protest, but I kept pushing, willing my truck to go faster, desperate to escape those eyes that seemed to see right into me. But the patrol car didn't let up. It stayed right on my tail, flickering closer and closer until it felt like it was inches away from my bumper. Then, as suddenly as it began, the flashing lights went dark. The patrol car vanished, leaving nothing but the open road behind me. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I kept going, my pulse still racing. The echo of those flashing lights burned into my mind. In the silence that followed, I could still hear the whispers, the voices on the radio, faint but insistent, warning me of the accident up ahead. And somehow I knew this wasn't over. Dawn was breaking by the time I finally rolled into the next town. The pale morning light cut through the fog, illuminating the small buildings lining the main street. My hands were still shaking as I parked at a truck stop and stumbled out of the cab, my legs feeling like they might give out any second. I made my way into the diner, barely aware of the world around me, just desperate for a seat and a cup of coffee. I sat at the counter, my mind reeling, trying to piece together what had just happened. It couldn't have been real, I told myself. There had to be some explanation. But as I looked around the diner, I caught the eye of another trucker, an older man with lines etched deep into his face. He gave me a knowing nod, and before I could stop myself, I started telling him everything. I told him about the patrol car, the officer's dead eyes, the way the lights had seemed to come alive, flashing and pulsing like something from another world. I could see the recognition in his eyes, and when I finished, he just shook his head, like he'd heard it all before. "Route 9'll do that to you," he said, his voice low. "Some things out there, they just don't rest." I nodded, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd escaped whatever had been following me. But as I glanced out the diner window, my stomach twisted. There, in the glass, reflected just over my shoulder, were those familiar flickering headlights, red and blue, pulsing in the distance. I blinked, and they were gone, leaving nothing but the empty street beyond. I left that diner in a hurry, but the feeling never left me. That sense of being watched, followed, marked by something that wasn't finished with me yet. I've stayed off Route 9 ever since, but sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the world is silent, I'll catch a flash of lights in my mirror, a brief glimpse of red and blue, a reminder that the phantom patrolman is still out there, waiting. I still remember how it started. A half-baked idea turned impulse, a spur-of-the-moment decision on an otherwise ordinary Friday night. The four of us, Danny, Lisa, Mark, and me, were lounging in my cramped apartment, barely paying attention to the muted horror movie flickering on my TV. We'd spent the whole week buried in work, stress weighing us down like stones. So, when Lisa suggested a road trip, none of us hesitated. We'd heard all about Nevada's extraterrestrial highway, the legendary Highway 375, stretching through miles of empty desert with almost no civilization in sight. It was eerie, open, vast, a place famous for its paranormal sightings and alien legends. People told stories of strange lights dancing over the hills, UFOs hovering, and bizarre figures seen out of the corner of your eye. Perfect fodder for a weekend getaway, we thought. A mix of thrill-seeking and morbid curiosity fueled us. Who wouldn't want to say they'd driven down a haunted highway? By the time we'd packed up and hit the road, it was already late in the afternoon. Danny drove first, a wide grin plastered on his face as he talked up all the crazy things we might see. Lisa played DJ, scrolling through a playlist of 80s rock and eerie ambient music that felt both nostalgic and ominous as the desert grew around us. Mark and I sat in the back seat, keeping an eye on the sun as it dipped closer to the horizon. As the miles rolled by, I felt that strange mixture of excitement and dread sinking in. I couldn't say what I was expecting. Probably nothing. Just another stretch of empty land, with a spooky name and some half-baked ghost stories attached. But as the landscape around us flattened out, with mountains looming far in the distance, the feeling of isolation became more real. There were no buildings, no gas stations, not even a distant light. Just the long, darkening stretch of road, framed by pale dirt and wispy brush, going on forever. By nightfall, we were deep in it. The only light was from our headlights, cutting a narrow path through the blackness that surrounded us on all sides. There's something strange about desert darkness. It's heavy, oppressive, like you're being swallowed up by the land itself. The thrill had faded, replaced by a tension that none of us wanted to admit. We didn't talk as much, our laughter dying off into occasional nervous chuckles. Then, as we were passing one of the few crooked signposts that warned of wildlife crossings, Lisa's voice broke the silence. "Do you guys see that?" She was staring out the passenger side window, her face lit up with an expression somewhere between fascination and fear. I followed her gaze, squinting into the distance. At first, I saw nothing but emptiness, dark and featureless. Then, as we drove on, something took shape in the distance. An outline at first, then slowly more distinct. A figure. A person standing on the side of the road, alone, unmoving. My stomach twisted as we got closer. "Is that a hitchhiker?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure was tall, gaunt, dressed in a long dark coat that hung off his shoulders like a shroud. His face was in shadow, obscured by the hood pulled low over his head. But even from a distance, something felt wrong. There was something off about him. Something unsettling in the way he stood, too still, like he was waiting for us. "Just keep driving," I muttered, though I couldn't explain the cold dread crawling up my spine. But Danny had already started slowing down, his eyes fixed on the stranger with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Come on, he might need help. I mean, he's out here alone, and who knows how long he's been standing there." I wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed that this was a bad idea. But we'd all shared a sense of adventure, a need to break the routine, and maybe that's why none of us spoke up. Danny pulled over, bringing the car to a slow stop a few feet from the hitchhiker. The headlights washed over him, casting his face in sharp relief. He looked wrong. Gaunt and hollow-cheeked, with eyes that seemed to sink deep into his skull. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and he didn't blink or flinch as he stared back at us, silent and still. Lisa was the first to roll down her window, her voice high-pitched with forced cheerfulness. "Hey, need a ride?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at us, and for a second, I thought I saw his lips twitch in what might have been a smile, or something close to it. He nodded slowly, then opened the door and slid into the seat beside her. Up close, the strangeness of his appearance was even more pronounced. He didn't smell like sweat or dirt, but there was a faint, musty odor around him, like old paper or dust. The feeling of unease tightened in my chest, but no one said anything. We just settled into silence, Danny pulling the car back onto the road as the hitchhiker stared straight ahead, unblinking. I tried to break the awkwardness. "So, where are you headed?" Nothing. He didn't even turn his head. Lisa shot me a look, her brow furrowing slightly as she tried to force a laugh. "Guess he's the strong and silent type, huh?" No one laughed. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside me, glancing back at the man who now filled the back seat like a shadow. It was as if he absorbed the light, making everything around him seem dimmer. I couldn't help but feel the weight of his presence, like he was pulling us down into some dark, hidden place. The desert around us seemed to press closer as we drove on, the silence in the car growing heavier with each passing mile. The excitement from earlier was gone, replaced by something darker, something we couldn't shake. We drove in silence, each of us stealing glances at the man as he stared blankly ahead, his face a mask devoid of any expression. The only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the occasional rattle from the dashboard. Lisa shifted in her seat, glancing at Danny as if hoping he'd say something, break the tension. But he just kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the wheel a little tighter than usual. After what felt like an eternity, Danny cleared his throat. "So, you from around here?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. He didn't even look at Danny. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, unblinking, his hands resting in his lap like they'd been placed there by someone else. The silence settled in again, thick and suffocating. "Maybe he just doesn't want to talk," I said, trying to break the tension myself. But even my own voice sounded weak, unsure. Lisa turned to the man, offering him a polite smile. "It's fine if you don't feel like talking, but do you need to be dropped off anywhere? We're kind of just driving, without a destination." Still nothing. He just sat there, his face a pale mask, expressionless. Up close, I could see faint bruising under his eyes, a bluish tint like he hadn't slept in days, or maybe longer. His clothes looked worn and slightly too big, as if he'd been slowly shrinking inside them. I glanced at Mark, who looked equally unsettled. He leaned over to whisper to me, "Maybe we should have just kept driving." I nodded slightly, regretting our decision to stop. There was something off about him, something more than just a stranger's unease or the strangeness of picking up a hitchhiker on a deserted road. It felt as though he brought the darkness with him, like he was carrying a shadow that now clung to us too. As we continued on, the desert outside seemed to grow even darker. The stars, which had been clear and bright earlier, were now obscured by wisps of cloud. The radio, which Lisa had been using to fill the silence, started crackling with static. She tried changing the station, but the static only got louder, shifting into strange, intermittent hums that sounded almost like whispering. "Guess we're out of range," she said, her voice barely masking the nervous edge underneath. A loud pop sounded from the back, and the dashboard lights dimmed, then flickered back to life, casting everything in a ghostly green glow. Danny muttered something under his breath, slapping the dashboard as if that would help. It didn't. The dim light persisted, casting weird shadows over everyone's faces, especially the hitchhikers. He was sitting so still that, for a moment, I thought he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. Then, suddenly, he turned his head slightly and looked right at me. His eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something empty in them, a depth that felt endless, like staring into a void. I forced myself to hold his gaze, though every instinct told me to look away. "You okay, man?" I asked, my voice cracking a little. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, unblinking, his expression as blank as ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking right through me, past me, into something else entirely. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Lisa glanced between us, obviously picking up on the tension. "Maybe he's just tired," she offered, trying to smile. "It's a long stretch of road out here, not a lot of places to rest." But there was nothing restful about him. If anything, he seemed to radiate a kind of cold energy, like an absence of life. It was as if he was sitting right on the border of existence, close enough to be seen, but distant enough that he didn't belong. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. He didn't belong here, not with us, not on this road, not in any way I could make sense of. Lisa turned her attention back to the road, and I noticed that her knuckles were white as she clutched her seatbelt. She was as spooked as the rest of us, though she was trying hard to hide it. Minutes ticked by in silence, the oppressive quiet filling the car until it felt like we were trapped inside a vacuum. The hitchhiker shifted slightly, the only movement he'd made since he'd entered the car, and in the greenish glow of the dashboard, I could have sworn I saw something strange. A faint shimmer on his skin, like dust particles caught in a beam of light. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion and nerves, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I glanced out the window, hoping for some kind of distraction, something to take my mind off the man sitting just a few feet away. As we drove on, Danny finally broke the silence. "You know, there are some creepy stories about this highway," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded strained. "Like what?" Mark asked, though I could tell he was just as tense as the rest of us. Danny grinned, his voice dropping as he tried to sound mysterious. "Well, they say people disappear out here. UFO sightings, ghosts, maybe even people who aren't actually people." Lisa groaned. "Don't start, Danny. The last thing we need is more creepy stories." Danny shrugged, glancing in the rearview mirror. "I'm just saying, you hear about it a lot. People picking up hitchhikers and then finding out they're not what they seem." A chill ran down my spine as he said it, but I didn't dare look at the hitchhiker. Something about that silence in the back seat felt heavier now, more pointed. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was listening to every word, that he knew exactly what we were saying. The shadows around him seemed to thicken, like a dark haze settling over his form, making his features even harder to make out. Suddenly, the car lurched as Danny swerved to avoid something in the road. He cursed, gripping the wheel tight as he brought us back on track. My heart was racing, and I glanced back at the hitchhiker, expecting some kind of reaction, but he hadn't moved at all, not an inch. Lisa looked back at me, her expression uneasy. "Are we sure about this?" she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. We'd made our choice, and now we were all in it together, trapped in this long, silent ride with a stranger who felt less and less like a person and more like something else, something darker. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as we drove deeper into the desert, the shadows creeping in around us like they were part of him, closing in with every mile. The darkness outside felt thicker now, like it was pressing in from every angle. The farther we drove, the more isolated we felt, as if the world beyond our headlights was slipping away, vanishing into that endless stretch of desert night. It wasn't just the landscape. It was something else, a feeling that clung to us, filling the car with an air so tense you could practically feel it settle on your skin. Danny tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, maybe our quiet friend back there is just a bit shy, huh?" he said, chuckling weakly. But his laugh sounded hollow, too forced, and it quickly died off into silence. No one else responded. There was no point. We all felt the same thing, the same icy dread that seemed to thicken with each passing mile. I glanced back at the hitchhiker, hoping, almost praying, for some kind of reaction. But he just sat there, as still and silent as ever, his dark eyes fixed on the road, his presence a weight on my chest. Then, without warning, the dashboard lights started to flicker. First, it was just a quick flash, then another. Lisa smacked the dashboard. "Great. Now we've got electrical problems?" She tried to laugh it off, but I could hear the fear in her voice. The flickering grew worse until the whole dashboard was blinking on and off in an erratic, almost frantic rhythm. And then, like some final, unwelcome gift from the universe, the radio crackled to life, filling the car with a wave of static. It was harsh, grating, like a scream caught in a tin can, rising and falling in uneven bursts. I reached over and tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. I twisted harder, but it was like the dial was frozen in place, locked on that horrible crackling noise. Out of nowhere, a voice broke through the static. It was faint, garbled, almost inhuman, a low whisper that drifted through the speakers, repeating words I couldn't quite make out. They weren't clear, but they sounded wrong. Twisted, like someone had taken a voice and warped it, stretched it into something unrecognizable. Lisa reached for the radio, her fingers trembling. What is this?" Danny's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. "It's just interference, probably from a radio tower or something." He didn't sound convinced. I leaned forward, trying to catch a word, anything that might make sense, but the voice kept twisting, like it was slipping through different languages, none of them quite human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the radio went dead, plunging us back into silence. My pulse was pounding. I looked at the hitchhiker again, half expecting to see him smirking or laughing or something. But he just sat there, his face blank and emotionless, staring out into the night. It was like he hadn't even noticed. Lisa shuddered, rubbing her arms as if she could shake off the chill that had settled in the car. This doesn't feel right. Maybe we should just turn around, you know?" Danny's grip on the wheel tightened. "We're in the middle of nowhere. Turning back now would be just as pointless as driving forward." Mark finally spoke up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Maybe we could let him out. I mean, he's not even saying where he needs to go, right? Maybe he's just looking for the next town." The hitchhiker didn't react. He just kept staring out the window, his face illuminated by the greenish glow of the dashboard lights. But the air felt thicker now, like it was pushing down on us, suffocating. Danny sighed, his hands visibly trembling as he tried to keep his focus on the road. "Fine, we'll pull over. Let him out and be done with it." He slowed the car, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. But as he eased his foot onto the brake, the car didn't respond. The pedal went straight to the floor with no resistance, no slowing, nothing. "Come on, what the hell?" Danny stomped on the brake, but it was useless. We were still moving, the car rolling along like it had a mind of its own. "Danny, stop messing around." Lisa's voice was tinged with panic, her fingers digging into the armrest. "I'm not messing around." Danny's voice rose, his face flushed with fear. He pumped the brakes, but it was like the car had decided we weren't allowed to stop. Even shifting to neutral didn't work. We just kept moving forward, as though something was propelling us onward. We all turned to look at the hitchhiker, our collective fear now directed at him. I half expected him to start laughing, or to say something, anything that might explain what was happening. But he didn't even blink. He just stared ahead like he was waiting for something we weren't ready for. My stomach twisted, a feeling of dread settling in like a sickness. I wanted to scream, to demand that he get out of the car, but I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, choked back by some primal, unnameable fear. What is he doing?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us answered. We just stared at the hitchhiker, our eyes wide, our hearts pounding, each of us feeling that same bone-deep terror creeping over us. And in that moment I knew that turning back wasn't an option. We were stuck here, trapped in this car, with no control over what happened next. Danny gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. If the brakes aren't working, maybe the engine will stall out or something. I just need to keep driving until... He didn't finish his sentence. The dashboard lights flickered again, and I swear, for a split second everything went dark. I couldn't see Danny or Lisa or Mark or anything outside the windows. Just pitch blackness, like we'd been swallowed by the desert itself. When the lights came back on, the hitchhiker was looking at me. I felt a chill run through me, freezing me in place. His face was just inches from mine, his eyes dark and hollow, empty. He didn't blink, he didn't move, he just stared at me, his gaze piercing, as though he was seeing something inside of me, something I didn't even know was there. Then, without a word, he leaned back, sinking into his seat, his gaze shifting back to the road ahead. But the image of his face, that expressionless stare, was burned into my mind. I felt like he'd left a mark on me, something I couldn't shake, like he'd taken a part of me with him in that gaze. Danny's voice broke the silence, shaky but determined. "We're getting him out. I don't care what it takes. We're stopping this car now." He slammed his fist against the dashboard, and the engine sputtered, coughed, and finally died. The car rolling to a slow, agonizing stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. Without a word, Danny turned in his seat, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Get out, now!" The hitchhiker didn't move. He just sat there, staring ahead, his face an unreadable mask. "Get out!" Danny's voice rose, his fists clenched, his face flushed with anger and fear. But the hitchhiker just stared forward, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. And in that silence I felt something else. A sense of inevitability, a creeping dread that told me this wasn't over. Because somehow, I knew he wasn't leaving. He was here to stay. We sat there, frozen, every breath shallow, every nerve tense as we waited for the hitchhiker to move. But he didn't. He sat as still as a statue, eyes forward, that same unreadable expression on his face. The silence in the car grew thick, pressing against us from all sides, suffocating. Danny finally snapped. I said, "Get out!" His voice was a mixture of rage and fear, echoing off the windows. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Danny with a look so vacant it made my stomach turn. There was no anger, no irritation, not even the slightest sign of emotion, just emptiness. Then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. The sound of it clicking open was like a release, breaking the tension just enough for us to let out the breaths we'd been holding. We watched, wide-eyed, as he climbed out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was moving through water. He stood beside the open door, his face half hidden in shadow, staring at us in a way that felt unsettlingly final. Danny wasted no time. He shifted the car into drive and pressed down on the gas. We started to roll forward, inch by inch, gaining speed as the car groaned to life. Relief washed over me until I looked back. He was still standing there, his figure dark against the road, watching us with that same hollow gaze. The further we drove, the smaller he became, until he was little more than a smudge against the desert backdrop. But the sense of relief didn't come. Instead, I felt like we were being followed somehow, like we hadn't really left him behind at all. Lisa spoke first, her voice shaky. What just happened? None of us could answer. We just sat in silence, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the faint buzz of static from the radio. I could still feel his eyes on us, that silent, empty gaze, even though he was miles behind. As the night deepened, the desert grew darker, more alien. The landscape looked different now, warped somehow, like we'd crossed over into another world where nothing was quite real. Shadows seemed to stretch across the road in strange shapes, twisting in the headlights. It was like the desert itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Danny tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, humorless sound. Maybe we should just keep going. Find a motel, get some rest. This road is getting to all of us. Mark was the first to agree, nodding quickly. Yeah, we just need to get somewhere with people. Somewhere normal. We drove on, our nerves frayed, our senses on high alert, each of us glancing out the windows, half expecting to see him appear again, walking alongside the car, keeping pace with us. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway, unrolling before us like a ribbon through the darkness. After about an hour, we saw it. A small, battered-looking motel sign flickering in the distance. The letters were faded, half of them burned out, but it was the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. We pulled into the parking lot, each of us breathing a collective sigh of relief. The place was a dump, the kind of rundown spot where you'd expect to find peeling wallpaper and a single buzzing light overhead, but we didn't care. It was shelter. It was somewhere we could shut the door and pretend that everything was okay. The clerk barely looked up as we checked in, handing us a single key with a bored expression. The room smelled like mildew and stale cigarettes, but it was warm, with 4 walls and a lock, and right then, that was all we needed. We dropped our bags and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence between us thick and uneasy. None of us wanted to talk about what had happened, but I knew we were all thinking it. The hitchhiker, the way he'd looked at us, the way the car had refused to stop, as if he had control over it. Lisa sat down beside me, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think he was even real? I didn't know how to answer. My head was pounding, my thoughts spinning in 100 different directions. He'd felt real. But there was something about him, something that didn't fit. It was like he was there, but not fully there. Like he'd stepped out of a nightmare and somehow crossed over into our world. Danny tried to laugh again, running a hand through his hair. Come on, guys, it's late. We're exhausted. He was just a creepy dude on the side of the road, right? Nothing supernatural about it. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Mark cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the floor. I saw something back there, he said quietly. We all turned to look at him, the air in the room growing colder. When we were driving away, he continued, his voice barely audible, I looked back and I swear I saw something. Not him, not exactly, but a shape, like a shadow that didn't belong. It was standing right behind the car, just watching. A shiver ran down my spine, and I could tell by the looks on Danny and Lisa's faces that they felt it too. No one said anything for a long time. We just sat there, each of us lost in our thoughts, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, Lisa broke the silence. Maybe we just need some sleep. We'll feel better in the morning. It was just a weird night, right? We nodded, more out of hope than belief. We didn't talk about it as we settled down, each of us finding a spot on the bed or floor, our exhaustion finally catching up with us. But as I lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That somehow he was still with us, his presence lingering in the corners of the room, waiting. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, trying to convince myself it was over. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside felt like a whisper, a reminder that we'd picked up something on that road. And whatever it wasn't going to let us go. Sleep didn't come. Every time I started to drift off, something, a sound, a shadow, would jolt me back awake, my heart racing. I kept my eyes on the door, as if expecting it to open on its own. The hitchhiker's face haunted me, his vacant eyes and empty expression burned into my memory. I wasn't alone in my restlessness. Danny lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, his face a mask of tension. Lisa tossed and turned, letting out shaky breaths with each toss, and Mark lay curled up on the floor, clutching a pillow like it could protect him. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the wall behind the bed, faint but deliberate, like someone gently rapping on the other side. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the room, gnawing at my nerves. I sat up, straining to listen, my mind racing. "Do you guys hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Danny nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, it's been going on for a while now." Lisa sat up, her eyes wide and fearful. "Maybe it's just the pipes, or something outside." But even she didn't sound convinced. Mark got to his feet, crossing the room to press his ear against the wall. "There's no one staying in the room next to us. I checked when we got here." Another chill ran through me. That meant whatever was making the noise was either in the wall or something else entirely. Danny, in a desperate attempt to shake off the tension, marched over to the wall and pounded on it. "Hey, cut it out!" he shouted, his voice braver than I knew he felt. For a second, the tapping stopped, and we all held our breaths, waiting. Silence. Then, slowly, the sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. Louder now, and closer, like it was moving toward us, closing in. My hands shook as I clenched the bedspread, each tap feeling like a hammer to my nerves. "We need to get out of here," Lisa whispered, her face pale. Danny nodded. "I don't care if we have to sleep in the car. This place is—" A sudden, harsh buzzing filled the room, cutting Danny off. It was the radio. It had turned on by itself, static filling the air, thick and grating. My skin prickled as I stared at the old radio on the nightstand, its cracked plastic case illuminated in the dark. The dial moved, slowly at first, then faster, flipping through stations in a blur of crackling voices and snippets of music. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The static faded, replaced by silence, and then a voice, deep, distorted, and barely above a whisper. It spoke slowly, like it was dragging each word out. "Hello, again." My blood ran cold. We all froze, staring at the radio, the voice echoing through the room, low and chilling. It was him. Somehow, I knew it was him, the hitchhiker. "You can't leave." the voice said, each word thick and drawn out, like it was crawling through the speakers. I grabbed Danny's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to go, now." He didn't argue. We scrambled to grab our bags, each of us moving in a frantic rush. The tapping on the walls grew louder, more erratic, like dozens of fingers drumming against the thin plaster, pressing in from every side. The room seemed to close in on us, the walls almost pulsating, like something was trying to push its way through. Mark wrenched the door open, and we bolted into the hallway. The motel was dead silent, the dim lights flickering as we ran toward the exit. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it was holding us back, making each step feel like we were wading through mud. Outside, the desert was eerily quiet, the vast, empty landscape stretching out beneath the moonlight. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, the feeling of safety only barely returning. Danny turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, the sound a relief after the stifling silence of the motel. We didn't speak as we sped away, the motel shrinking in the rearview mirror, its neon sign flickering like a warning. My heart pounded as I looked back, half expecting to see the hitchhikers standing there, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just an empty parking lot, bathed in the cold light of the moon. As we drove, the silence in the car was thick, each of us wrapped up in our own fear, our own unanswered questions. We kept our eyes forward, refusing to look back, as if we could leave everything behind if we just kept moving. But then, a voice cut through the silence. "You think you can leave?" It came from the back seat. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The hitchhiker was sitting in the back, his dark eyes staring at me, his expression as blank and hollow as ever. His presence filled the car like a dark cloud, a suffocating weight pressing down on us. We all froze, too shocked to move, too terrified to scream. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his eyes boring into me. "You picked me up," he whispered, his voice low and chilling. "Now, you can't let me go." Danny swerved, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel, but the hitchhiker didn't react. He just kept staring, his gaze steady, unblinking, as though he were looking straight through us. The radio crackled to life again, filling the car with that same distorted static. It grew louder and louder, until it felt like the noise was inside my skull, pressing against my mind, driving me to the edge of panic. And then, without warning, the radio went silent. I turned back, but the hitchhiker was gone. We drove in silence, the road stretching out before us, endless and empty. But I knew he was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting.